The thing about the 360 and the PS3 is that you have to consider that these are two very different philosophies in terms of how Sony and Microsoft have gone about building their consoles. The PS3 is basically a Sony product through and through, and what I mean by that is that it has Sony technology through and through. It's got a Sony design with the help of IBM cell processor, which has the same architecture that Sony's been using for the PlayStation 2, going all the way back to the PlayStation 1. It also has, or they were heading towards, the same kind of graphics processor architecture that they've been using again since the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and were going to use for the PlayStation 3 until that fell through. The 360 basically has its roots in the PC, and its architecture is very much, well, at least far more similar to the PC architecture than you see in the PS3 or the Wii. The Wii, by the way, is a custom architecture, not too unlike, at least more similar to the PC than the PS3 is, but it is a very proprietary piece of technology. It's very custom designed for gaming. The PS3, the philosophy behind it is that the CPU is, or should be involved in, or responsible for handling graphics. This is a carryover from back in the day where we didn't have graphics accelerators, at least not on the PC. Back in the day, your CPU did your sound, it did your graphics, and it ran your game's engine. It did everything. And back in those days, what was sought after more than anything else was a really fast processor. And it needed to be a processor that could not just handle general purpose processing, which is what's required to run the game's engine, but floating point processing, which is processing that requires precise math, which is especially important or useful when calculating 3D graphics. Now, going back to the PlayStation 1, that was the design philosophy that Sony used, and most of that was, you know, because they didn't have any other choice. There really weren't any graphics processors, dedicated graphics processors that they could couple with the PlayStation 1's CPU. So what you had was a CPU that did the general purpose processing, did most of the graphics processing, and had a small little graphics processor that just painted the picture on the screen at the end. Now the PlayStation 2 was basically the exact same thing. The Sony designed processor, the Emotion Engine, you know, which is just a marketing term, and what that was a CPU that did general purpose processing and a little bit of floating point, and it had two small coprocessors that they referred to as Vector 01, Vector 0 and Vector 01, which basically did floating point math. And the way the PlayStation 2 worked was the CPU pretty much handled all the graphics, including the game engine and the sound and all that other stuff. And it had a very simple graphics processor that it used to paint the final image on the screen. That graphics processor was very limited in its functions, but the PS2 had the benefit of having a really powerful CPU at the time. The PS3 follows, or was going to follow, the exact same philosophy. There's a cell processor. It has a main core that is just like one of the 360's 3 main cores, but instead of having multiple cores like the 360, it has one core and then 7 sub-cores, which are floating point processors, just like, more or less, just like the ones you saw on PlayStation 2, except the PlayStation 2 only had 2 of them, and the PS3 now has 7 of them. And of course the processor runs at a much faster speed. It's called the cell, has a slightly different architecture, and of course it excels at drawing 3D graphics. What Sony was going to do, instead of having the NVIDIA graphics processor that the PS3 has in it now, was it was going to use two cell processors. One to do the game engine and help in some graphics, and the other one just to do graphics. Now it turned out that that idea was horrible. And the reason why it was horrible was because they saw companies like Microsoft using dedicated graphics processors to do graphics. Now it just happens to be that graphics cards that you see from NVIDIA and ATI are far superior to anything that any CPU can do, and that includes the cell. The cell is a piece of shit when it comes to graphics, and that's the bottom line. So what Sony did was they scrapped the second cell processor idea and instead plugged in an NVIDIA graphics card that NVIDIA was, of course, happy to sell to Sony. Now what happened there was, originally, like we said, the PS3 was supposed to be a totally different machine to begin with. And what happened was NVIDIA came in at a late stage, and their processor was basically just kind of plugged into the design. And unlike the 360, unfortunately, like in the 360, the graphics processor and the CPU were not designed or meant for each other from the ground up. They were not built for each other from the ground up. So there are some flaws in the PS3 design, some bottlenecks that limit its capabilities. Now, the main thing about the PS3 design is that it has an overabundance of this floating point processing. It has a graphics card that's very floating point intensive because, like we said, it deals with graphics. And it has a processor, a CPU, that is also floating point intensive. Now there's a problem with this. The problem is that the limiting factor to the quality of graphics that the system can display is a function of how fast the graphics processor is. It matters nothing that the CPU can do all this graphics and that the graphics card in the PS3 can also do all this graphics and that it can combine that mathematical power to produce these fantastic graphics and then display them on the screen. It doesn't matter because the graphics card has a limit and it can only draw so much on the screen. It's just a physical limitation as to how much it can process. So it doesn't matter how much the cell helps out, it will never pass that bar. Because the cell isn't doing the rendering. The graphics card does the rendering. That's what's responsible for what you see on the screen. So no amount of help from the cell is going to get this thing to go any faster. It's a fixed limit. It just isn't going to go anywhere. Now that said, the cell processor can provide the RSX, which is what the graphics processor and the PS3 is called. It can provide it with far more data than it can handle. So theoretically, programmers, developers should be able to max out what the RSX processor can do. They can theoretically, more or less, take it to its limits. And that's great. It's got a CPU with more than enough horsepower to feed that graphics processor to do everything and anything that it is capable of doing. The only downside is, of course, is that while the CPU has all that floating point processing power, what it gains in that, it lacks in the general purpose processing side of things, which you'll see now when we switch over to the 360.